All right, hello and welcome. This is one of the final three talks of the 1968 Year That Shaped a Generation series that was sponsored by the SMSU History Club, and we're here at the library tonight, so thank you, Paula. And also I'd like to thank Joan Gittins and Jeff Kolnick, who've been coordinating this whole series. Tonight we have mine, which is on the art of 1968, and Dr. Loft, who's on the music, and then in a couple weeks, the last one will be Sheila Tabaka, who'll be talking about dress and costume during that period, which is kind of fun. All right, so what I've done with this is try and pick a sampling of the different kinds of visual art from the period kind of around 1968. I can't promise that every artwork is actually from 1968, but it's in the kind of mood and tone of that period. And I've chosen examples from both fine art and graphic design, because I teach a history of graphic design course. And there's lots of really neat things that's kind of the Mad Men era and a little after. So I guess we'll get started. And my clicker works, yes. Just so you're aware, 1968 is the hippie era, and people like to walk around without their clothes on during certain things. And some of the posters as well have some nudity on them, so just be aware of that. All right. The last time I gave a talk here, it was for the World War I series, and it was on the propaganda posters of the period. And when I ran across this quote in Hertzberg's article about 1968 in The Guardian, I thought it really made me think. 1918 is 50 years removed from 1968, and we in 2018 are 50 years removed from 1968. So it's kind of the midpoint between these two eras. And the kinds of events that happened that were so world-changing in 1918, we had the same kinds of things happening in 1968. All right, so starting with a little graphic design here. This is the cover of the Esquire magazine from April 1968. And this was a period of the Vietnam War, of course, and lots of people were getting drafted into the service. There were deferments possible, but some people just refused the draft. And one of them was Cassius Clay, who, when he adopted the Muslim faith, became Muhammad Ali. So in '67, he had been suspended from his profession, fighting. And so when graphic designer George Lois, who was the Esquire graphic design head, decided to do a cover with Ali, he chose to place him in the same kind of pose and position as a Christian martyr, Saint Sebastian, had been done in an earlier Italian Renaissance painting that you see over there, the Botticini. The idea that he was being persecuted for his faith, the same way that the Christian martyrs were, was the idea that he was trying to get across. And Ali was he wasn't quite sure, he said, that's a Christian saint. He says, yes, but the same idea of persecution. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated that same month in April 4th. So race relations were also a really important tenor, and we'll see a lot of that reflected in the art of this period. 1968, of course, was the first moon landing, and I was 8 years old, and I was allowed to stay up at night to watch the moon landing. I remember it very clearly. And Earthrise is one of the most famous photographs of 1968, taken by the Apollo astronauts. And the other thing I was allowed to stay up late to watch was Star Trek, because my dad was a big Star Trek fan. As part of popular culture, which is also the arts, we have the first interracial kiss on television between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. And so it went out to millions of homes, but not the ones in the American South, because most of the NBC TV stations refused to show it, even in reruns. Okay. All right, so when we're looking at the fine art of this period, we see that there are a lot of changes in what is considered an actual art object, or whether actually you even need an object. So the disappearance between, the distinctions between art media. So you're going to have paintings that have three-dimensional stuff sticking out of them. So they're kind of blending with sculpture. You're going to have theater blending with art in the happenings and the installations, using real objects or photographic images instead of just painting things. Site-specific art, things that are placed very out of place or very overscale for the place that they're put in. The process, the relationship to who's looking at it becomes almost more important than making an actual art object. And then the use of appropriated images and period style. We'll see, for example, the Art Nouveau had a very strong influence on the psychedelic posters of the San Francisco 1968. Claes Oldenburg's soft toilet is an example of the idea of using industrial and natural materials rather than traditional wood or marble to do sculpture. So it's soft toilet, which you wouldn't want to sit on that thing. Be squishy because it's made out of vinyl and wood and wire. It's kind of typical of that industrial material kind of use. All right, so what had happened before the period of the 60s was in the 40s and 50s, the predominant art movement was abstract expressionism. And pictured here are two of the main abstract expressionist artists, Jackson Pollock, also known as Jack the Dripper, because of his technique of dripping the paint on the canvas on the floor, and his wife Lee Krasner. She also did a kind of abstraction, but she was basing it on natural forms. Right bird left is basically deconstructing what makes a bird and using the bright colors. Krasner had was kind of overshadowed by Pollock in some ways, but many critics considered her his equal in importance. And one of the male art critics, I love this quote, "She was so good you couldn't tell that it was painted by a woman." Yeah, so gender issues are another thing we're going to deal with here. All right, another of the previous trends, and one that abstract expressionism was kind of bucking up against, was realism. And Norman Rockwell, most famous for his Saturday Evening Post covers, was kind of disturbed by the fact that his style of art was no longer au courant. It wasn't what the people wanted to do. So he did this painting called The Connoisseur, where he has this very staid man in his gray suit with his hat and his umbrella looking at a Pollock type painting. And he had a lot of fun learning how to do that because he had to make the Pollock-like painting. And he ended up taking one of his studies for the painting and entering it in an art show in Cooperstown under an Italian artist's name, and it won first prize. That's the painting there. Very different than a normal Rockwell. Rockwell also had a strong social conscience that didn't always show up in his Saturday Evening Post work. And he actually left them in 1963 to go work for Look magazine as an illustrator for their articles. Many of them during that period were about the racial tensions and the integration both in the urban area and in the suburbs. This painting is titled New Kids in the Neighborhood, 1967, subtitled Negroes in the Suburbs. And of course, Negroes was a word that was used for African Americans or blacks during that period. The African American family is moving in, and they're kind of confronted by a group of white children from the neighborhood. And he's used kind of subtle coding between the two groups to give us hope that eventually they're going to just get together and play. So first, the differences, you see the African American little girl is holding a white cat, and a black German Shepherd dog is the one that the kids have. And of course, German Shepherds were the attack dogs of the police that they were sent after during the race riots. So it's a puppy and they're kids, they can learn, they can do different things. Both boys have baseball gloves and the same sneakers on, they're about the same height. Both girls have pink hair ties. So even though the nosy white neighbor is peeking out the window wondering what's going on, the painting is hopeful. It gives us hope that these kids will just be kids and end up playing baseball together. Okay. Women and racial issues, feminist issues, racial issues, were very much in the forefront during this period. Faith Ringgold is a really important artist because she kind of embodies both of those things during this time. The style of art that she chose to do was kind of straight abstraction, and her most famous work is Tar Beach, which is a story quilt, which she got into later in the late 70s and 80s. And she actually wrote a children's book based on Tar Beach that won the Caldecott Medal, the award for children's fiction. But in this earlier period, in the 1960s, she was coming up against racial and also chauvinist prejudice in trying to get her work out to people. So she had two really important gallery encounters that kind of informed the artwork that she ended up doing. One was in 1963, and her work was very traditional, very representational, flowers and trees and landscapes. And when she shopped it around to galleries, she kept getting refused. And she finally kind of bucked up her courage and said, well, what's wrong with it? Why won't you take it? And they said that it's the 1960s and you're doing stuff that people were doing 100 years ago. You need to paint about your life, your story, your environment. What is your reality today? So she started painting what she came to call her American People series. And she tried to enter some of those works in the first World Festival of Black Arts in 1966. But the curator for that, a male curator, refused her because they said, basically, you don't know anything about art. You don't know about visual rhythm or movement. Now, she had attended the City College of New York. She had to major in education because they wouldn't let women major in art. But then she also went on and got a master's degree in art. So she knew what she was doing. But because of who she was presenting her work, they weren't going to give her the show. So she basically said, I'll show you. So rhythm and movement, yeah, to the nth degree. This is part of the American People series. It's number 21 and it's called Die. And painted in 1967, exhibited in 1968. And the huddled children in the middle, kind of that same little pink dress that the girl had in the Rockwell painting. But it's a series of vignettes of the same African-American and white guy and the women, and there's a knife. I guess I could point it out on here. There's a knife, well, it's not letting me, and a gun, and then kind of the reaction as everything tumbles apart because of that racial violence. Because she'd been to art school and she knew about the history of art, she said she was inspired by Pablo Picasso's famous painting Guernica, which was a protest against the bombing of the civilians by the Nazis of the city of Guernica in Spain. Franco let them do that. And the migration series done by the African-American painter Jacob Lawrence in the 1940s about the great migration of African-Americans to the industrial North. And his painting, one of the largest race riots occurred in East St. Louis. And again, you can see the similarities in the action and kind of the terror and the violence that's happening between the two groups. All right, so because of who she was and painting who she was very involved in the activism of the period, both protesting for black artists to get more space in museums and for women to get it. And in 1968, she organized a demonstration to get 50% of black artists in the Whitney Gallery. They only had like 9%. And in 1970, the same thing to get women's art into the exhibition program. One of the things they did was distribute eggs that they had painted black and written 50% on all over the museum. And I can imagine if they didn't find all of them, you know what happens to eggs after a while. And actually some of them were even raw, so you picked them up and they would break. So they were really kind of using their power to protest the injustice. All right, here we get some naked people, sorry. This is another type of art, conceptual art. And with this, it's the idea of observing it while it's happening, rather than having an artifact, although they're often photographs, to take home with you. So as it says, it's the idea, not the object, the process, not the thing. Performance art means that you have to be there to fully experience it. There was often music and dancing, as well as kind of play-like demonstration things. And again, it's breaking that barrier between art and theater. This is from a performance that the Japanese-American artist Yayoi Kusama did at the Board of Elections in November 1968. Nixon looks a little disgruntled that the girls are over with Wallace and Muskie there, and you can see the American flag at the bottom. Kusama had been she wanted to be an artist from the time she could even think about it. She was always drawing and painting, even though her mother ripped up her drawings. And by 1955, she wanted to be an artist. She wanted that to be her life, but she couldn't find any role models around her. So she actually started researching and looking up the best women artists, or who were considered the best. And she decided that she was going to write to Georgia O'Keeffe. So she wrote this really sweet letter asking her for her help and her advice on how to make art her life. And O'Keeffe actually invited her to come to America and stay with her in New Mexico, which she didn't end up doing, but just the idea that someone that famous would care to write back to her. And they did eventually meet up in her studio in New York City and had a lovely afternoon drinking tea and talking about art. So women helping women was a big part of this. Kusama is still alive and still working today, and there was actually a really good film called Infinity that showcases her work in a film that just came out in September. In the New York art scene, she was in the avant-garde. She was always pushing the envelope, and she came up against Andy Warhol in the pop movement a little bit. And I've seen her work defined as sometimes as pop art, and sometimes as minimalist art, and sometimes as performance art. Again, she came up against a lot of sexist and racist barriers in the art world as a woman of color. And she also had kind of a gender fluid identity, and as we'll see, a lot of her artwork reflected that. So these are some of the happenings that she staged. And they were often in the nude, protest parties, and important landmarks around New York City. And just a couple examples of them: a love festival, anti-war happening, the anatomic explosion happening, kind of protesting capitalism at the stock exchange. Okay, her gay wedding happening was one of her gender protests. And she held it at her studio, which she had decorated with these phallic-looking things with dots. Dots are her thing, all over. She painted dots all over the nude bodies of the people participating. She was the only one that was clothed. And she married them, and then they continued through the wedding supper and to the consummation of the marriage. And she felt your sexuality was your own, and homosexuality was nothing to be ashamed of. So 50 years ago, that was quite a statement that she was making when we just got, rights for gay marriage a few years ago, a couple years ago. And also, again, this was right before the Stonewall riots that were for gay rights. Okay, another kind of performance art is called autodestructive art. And it has its roots in the early 60s, but you'll see it gets kind of reflected a little later into 68. Gustav Metzger was the one who wrote the manifesto on autodestructive art. And autodestructive art is art that there's no object left when you're done, because the process of making it destroys it. So he went to London. You can see the St. Paul's behind him there. And he spray painted acid in a pattern onto this silk cloth. And nylon cloth, and it just basically fell apart as he did it. So the idea was that he felt art had become too commercial, and it was all about having these objects to sell, and so he didn't want that. Everything old is new again. The graffiti artist Banksy just did something very similar. He sold his painting Girl with a Balloon for $1.4 million, and as the gavel came down, it shredded like a paper shredder. You can see it coming out the bottom there. And it didn't work it was supposed to shred the whole thing, but only shredded halfway. And the guy that bought it renamed it Love is in the Bin, and it's now worth over $2 million because it was shredded. The art world is crazy. In 1968, the Who guitarist Pete Townshend, who is known for smashing his guitars, well, there was a reason behind it, because he was a disciple of Metzger and had read his treatise and met with him, and they projected images of him behind them in concerts. So autodestructive is destroying his own instrument. All right, minimalism. This is where we get that industrial materials. And while the abstract expressionists were trying to show their own emotions and their own feelings about things, here we get people that want to remove all trace of the artist's hand. They often even didn't make their own work. They would design it, and somebody else would actually fabricate it for them. So very simplified geometric forms. Non-referential color means that, you know, if the horse is brown, in this kind of art, the horse could be purple. Doesn't matter because that's not what it's really about. Compositional concerns are left by the wayside, although they're often kind of compartmentalized repetitions of geometric shapes. An important artist in the minimalist style is Eva Hesse. And she was born in Germany, but emigrated to America after the Nazi threat. Her family was Jewish, she was Jewish. And she went to Pratt Institute and trained as a commercial artist, but became attracted to the abstract expressionists. But in 1966, she started experimenting with minimalist forms. And her work, Hang Up, is probably what kind of turned the tide for her and brought her into that realm. That's it there. It is a plain white canvas, and then the frame is cloth wrapped, and there is a kind of a tube, a steel tube that protrudes from it. So here she's mixing painting and sculpture, and it's not, you know, the painting is not a painting of something, but it's about the relationship between the materials. She's also considered post-minimalist, so by 1968, she was doing work that had more organic nature to it. So her Repetition 19-3 from 1968 shows that it kind of look like luminaria candles, but they're actually made out of, polyester and fiberglass resin, which stand up for a while, but they kind of deteriorate, which didn't bother her. She was quoted saying, "Life doesn't last, art doesn't last, it doesn't matter." The kind of sad irony to that is 2 years later, she would be dead. She died in 1970, she had brain cancer. So the idea that she knew everything was ephemeral, even life, is kind of reflected in her work. Okay, so now we're going to kind of go totally the other way into that commercial art idea, and we have American pop art. And pop art is, again, a reaction against that abstract expressionism because it's kind of recreating or reimagining, repurposing things that come from the commercial realm in many cases. So this vintage 1930s, 1940s Campbell Soup ad is reinterpreted by Andy Warhol in his series of Campbell Soup can paintings. And there's some of these like Pepper Pot. I've never heard of Pepper Pot, but I guess it was back in 1962. So a lot of the subject matters of these reflect comics, movie stars, consumer culture, packaging, etc. He removed himself even further from the process by going to silk screening rather than painting, so less hands-on, and his color screen prints of the Campbell soup cans, and that repetition of form was very important. He had started out with he had a portfolio that had a series of comic book style drawings, but Lichtenstein got to the galleries first, and so they didn't want Warhol's work. So then he went back to his roots as a commercial artist and started doing his version of different kinds of packaging. He also wanted to comment on fame. He's famous, in part for saying in the future everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. And everybody gets their 15 minutes these days because of Twitter and so on. And so he took images of the famous and silk screened them in multiple repetitions, again in that non-realistic color palette. That's a poster from a show at the Karl Stroher Gallery. This I thought was an interesting case. The revolutionary Che Guevara was a kind of popular figure, and this particular photograph had been kind of floating around, kind of like the one of Marilyn previously. And an artist named Gerard Malanga did a fake Warhol. This is it. And when Warhol found out about it, he wasn't really upset. He just wanted them to pay him for it because it was his style. He didn't actually do the silk screening. Again, he designed things, but he had assistants that carried out the actual work. So he felt this is just kind of the same thing, but just give him the money. All right. He also did some social commentary, though most people don't know a lot about that. This is called Red Race Riot from 1963, and it's again a silkscreen image. In this case, it's German shepherds attacking people that are in a black civil rights protest. So he repeats the same image over and over again, and he has it in the saturated red color, so it's kind of hard to make out the scene. So it comes down to almost resembling wallpaper, or the repetition, we kind of get numbed to it. And seeing it every night in the news, or seeing news about the Vietnam War and the casualty counts, he's kind of making a comment on that ordinariness of evil. All right, he had his own evil come into his life in 1968, probably not his favorite year. And he had worked with the feminist actress and filmmaker Valerie Salinas. And she was a very troubled woman. She had gone through some horrible experiences when she was younger. She was raped. And so she had a strong dislike for men. She had acted in a couple of Warhol's little films, and she had gone to him with a script that she wanted him to produce, and he said no to her. So she went back a few days later with a gun and shot him and one of his assistants, and he almost died. She started the society Scum, which is the society to cut up men. Yeah, so you can see where her head was at. He did survive, but he was forever physically and kind of mentally scarred. This Alice Neal painting, this portrait, shows him with the scars left over from the surgery, and also the kind of thing that he's wearing around his abdomen. That's kind of literally holding in his internal organs because the skin was so damaged. While he was in the hospital, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and he said they're coming after all of us. So he lived another 20 years, but 1968 really was a big year for him. All right, so one of his main competitors in the pop art field was Lichtenstein. And he chose the comic book style to do his large-scale paintings. So it's like you took a comic strip, but you only took one panel out of it and enlarged it. And he used the same kind of dots that they use in the Sunday paper, the Ben-Day dots, and then bold outlines, usually primary colors. These are all kind of the same color palette, the red and the yellow and the white and the black. And he also applied it to commercial art. So here's one. I love that this is for the Tyrone Guthrie Theater in Minnesota for Merton of the Movies. And then his modular painting with 9 panels. Again, you could make a tile pattern out of that. It's so regularized. Okay. In 1968, he got an unusual commission to do a portrait of Robert Kennedy for the cover of Time magazine. Kennedy, of course, was running for president at this time. And even though Lichtenstein didn't often do portrait commissions, he admired the kinds of things that Kennedy was saying, so he accepted it. And he also accepted a second commission at the same time to do the cover illustration for an article about gun violence. When Kennedy saw this, he liked it, but he said, I really don't have red dots all over my face. So the month after that, after Kennedy had been assassinated, Lichtenstein's gun cover appeared. And the idea that gun violence, again, we're 50 years out from that, but it's still the same kind of thing. This Lily Rothman article talking about how it is eerily still relevant. The U.S. outside of our country is regarded as a blood-drenched, continent-wide shooting range where toddlers blast off with real rifles, housewives pack pearl-handed revolvers, and political assassins stalk their victims at will. So, yeah, irony to the commission. All right, example of a pop art sculptor is our melting toilet guy, Klaus Oldenburg. And he had wanted to move beyond the smaller scale soft sculptures into large installations for outdoor, for environmental sculpture. He's probably best known in Minnesota for the Spoon Bridge and Cherry that's in the Walker Sculpture Garden. And he had designed this monument, lipstick ascending on caterpillar tracks, for Yale, which was his alma mater. And when the students saw the commissioned drawing, they decided that they wanted to purchase this and sponsor it so that they could place it where they wanted to place it on the campus. And where they chose to put it was in front of the campus war memorial. So it became a kind of cause célèbre war protest rather than just a decorative sculpture. You can see the kind of caterpillar tracks down below, and then the inflatable, very phallic lipstick there. All right, this one makes me dizzy if I look at it too long. Optical art, op art is the next example. And Bridget Riley, Bridget is a British artist, and she was working with the idea of creating the illusion of motion on a flat two-dimensional surface. So by the thickness and thinness of the lines and how closely the colors are placed next to one another, again, if you look at it too long, it makes you dizzy, but it should look like it's actually moving. That's called cataract. How many colors are in that painting? What colors do you see?
Blue, red, gray, brown.
Okay. Yeah, there's only 3. There's red and black and white. Yeah, but the more you look at it, the more it's kind of reflective of the colors around you. So there was a big exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called The Responsive Eye, which was all about this kind of mind-bending, moving art. And she was picked for the cover illustration there. And like Warhol and the minimalists, sometimes she didn't do her own work. She designed it and then had her assistants do it for her. So there was a little hands-off or removed. Op art influenced popular culture in a big way. And from the bathing suit to the glasses and the little paper dresses, which Sheila might talk about. My favorite one is the vertigo drug to keep you from having vertigo. That's the packaging. It's like, look at this, and if it makes you dizzy, you need our drug, I guess. Whoa. Okay. All right. It also seems to have influenced the Olympics design for the Mexico Olympics. And of course, '68 was probably most famous for the Black Panther or Black rights protest. But when Lance Wyman, the designer, was looking for inspiration for this, he said he took it from the Mexican folk art motifs, which had the parallel lines in curvilinear form. So he has the '68 kind of made out of the circular letter font that he invented, interspersed with the colors of the Olympic sign. So that's him up there. Very op art. All right, so another important movement was the psychedelic art movement. And I'm going to focus just on the late 1960s concert posters that came out of San Francisco music scene during this time. There's lots of other psychedelic artists, but that's my focus. And according to my sources, the term psychedelic music was first brought forth in this album cover by the group the 13th Floor Elevators. And Jan and I both were like, never heard of these people. We did find some of their music on YouTube, but it's the cover art I'm concerned about, not their music here. The very loose, free-form nature of it, the really bright colors, the use of dots, kind of like we've seen before with Kusama. And then the more I looked at that, the more I'm like, I know a painting that this reminds me of. Why can't? So I started looking through Georgia O'Keeffe's work, and I found Music, Pink and Blue, music, from 1918. And I realized that the same, kind of forms and colors were being used here. It looks more like an eye in the 13th Floor Elevators, but it has a little eye in the middle. But that same, O'Keeffe's often accused of using sexual imagery in her flower paintings, and that almond mandorla shape as a symbol of a transition. It can represent the birth canal. It can represent returning. The medieval artists use it to frame Christ returning for the Last Judgment. So they're putting a lot of different ideas and symbolism into the things that they're picking here. The all-seeing eye, like on the back of the dollar bill above the pyramid. The whole psychedelic art movement is entwined with people going on LSD trips. That was the Kool-Aid acid test. Was something that was part of the San Francisco scene at this time. And looking at something and it kind of visually moving when you were involved with the drugs was also a part of psychedelia, according to some sources. All right, so I'm an art historian. I have to go back a little in history. Some of the influences that these psychedelic poster artists say they had, and most of them went to art school, were the Art Nouveau artists. Jules Cheret in the 19th century in Paris kind of invented the modern poster. The material that he used is called lithography, the printmaking format. So you're drawing or painting with this kind of waxy substance on a flat stone. So you can get much more painterly looking forms than having to set it up in block print typeface and print that way. So you get these very loose letter forms and bulgy letters. You get lots of diagonals for motion. You get the people interacting with the letters. This guy down at the bottom is like diving right through them, or they're standing on them like they did in medieval manuscripts. So there's lots of kind of interaction between the text and the picture. The Czech Art Nouveau artist, Alphonse Mucha, was probably one of the most famous of them, and here we have people who are just basically ripping him off. They have the James Gang and Cream. Their poster is exactly like Mucha's Dance Rose, and then the Yardbirds poster is just like the Madame ML. And the Raw Sugar Art Studio is out of Cleveland, Ohio, and so they're the ones responsible for this thievery. Then you get people that alter the original designs. Again, this is probably Mucha's best known design for Job rolling papers, also popular during the 1960s. And you can see he's just basically changed up the color palette into those more day glow, warmer colors. All right. Can't really consider Milton Glaser psychedelic, but his poster's kind of a precursor for some of the ones that we'll see in a little bit. Glaser is one of the original madmen, Madison Avenue advertising gurus. And he's best known for his I Love New York, his little symbol up there created for the 1976 bicentennial. And his most famous poster is this one of Minnesota native Bob Dylan. I had to include Dylan in here. So this was the poster that was to be inserted into his greatest hits album in 1968. And the real ones will always, they were folded up to put in there. So if they don't have the fold lines, you know it's a copy. And he copied it from the silhouette of Marcel Duchamp, and also invented the typeface for the lettering. And then he went and looked at German Art Nouveau, the young style, Jugendstil. And you can see that sinuous curving line and the profile. He's given it more of a rainbow effect there, but the Art Nouveau is coming out in this particular design. All right, so in California poster art, these are the big five. And each one of them contributed something slightly different. I'm going to show you a little bit of each of their work, but I'm going to focus on the guy that's second from the right, Wes Wilson, because he's really kind of the father of San Francisco poster design. 1967, Summer of Love, and that whole period from 66 to 69 was there was tons and tons of concerts going on in San Francisco. And the idea behind this art is that they're taking the influence of past traditions in art and merging them with a real commercial sensibility to advertise these concerts. So that's probably why these are so properly famous. So Stanley Mouse and Alton Kelly began designing posters for the Avalon Theater, and then later the very famous Fillmore West. So that's their Grateful Dead, and that skull with the flower crown kind of became their symbol. Victor Moscasco was actually a Yale educated, and he was a professor at the San Francisco Institute of Art. And he used photo collage and different techniques in his posters, so slightly different. And then Rick Griffin used a lot of kind of out there, almost hallucinogenic symbols in the look of his works. We see this bloodshot eyeball holding a skull and having kind of a snaky body with his stuff. All right, so Wes Wilson, again, had gone to art school, and he was hired in 1966 by Bill Graham, who was the big concert promoter of the era. And he, for his inspiration, he had to turn out a lot of posters in a short amount of time, 2 to 4 posters a week. So he was constantly going back to the old style posters, the Art Nouveau and Jugendstil, to look for ideas he could adapt or steal. So the Camille Martin poster from 1894, he had an assignment to do a poster for a concert by the band called The Byrds. So he knew he wanted a bird on it. So this peacock gave him the idea of having that kind of sinuous form of the peacock, and then where the original poster had the leaves, he puts the text. So he had that same kind of curvy X on both of them. So he's basically cutting this poster in half and only using half the idea. But he's synthesizing it, changing the color palette, but using stuff from the past to do that. What first got him noticed, though, was a Berkeley protest poster against the Vietnam War. This is Are We Next? His first version of the design that he showed to his friends, and they were kind of like, ugh, didn't have the Are We Next at the top. And so it kind of looked like, be aware, Nazis in America, is that good, is that bad? So he definitely wanted people to know that he thought that was bad. But this is what Graham noticed and heard about, and so that's why he got hired for the job. One of his first assignments was this 1966 Beatles poster, and it's different than the style he's going to adapt, but again, it had to be done quickly. This is the Beatles' last concert in the United States, and he's using kind of hand-drawn lettering techniques, the yin-yang symbols, only with the Union Jack and the US flag, and then kind of silkscreen photography. So he's using a lot of different techniques in this one. But this is the one that's often considered the first of the psychedelic San Francisco posters, what he called the Flames poster. And he's using red and green, which are complementary colors. Complementary colors are opposite each other on the color wheel. They visually excite each other, warm and cool, kind of fighting. And so he's got this flame. Now the text isn't very easy to read unless you get really close to it, but it attracts you visually. It brings you in close so that you can look at those pointy letter forms and figure out what it's saying. Another trend in these posters was catching the people's attention by having a nude female on the poster. Usually direct gaze, engaging us, and the text doesn't really seem all that important. It's really hard to read. It's really small in some cases. I love how he says, I think the female form is always going to be an interesting and fascinating image. Yeah, that's how you catch people's attention. Okay, now from all this exposure, he gets asked to do the cover of Playboy magazine. They had to keep the same font for the word Playboy, but he could do whatever he wanted with the rest of it. So ironically, he didn't do a nude for this one, but yeah, but he's got that same kind of wavy hair that they could be the bunny ears, they could be her hair, and she's got that kind of over-the-shoulder come-hither look going on there in the Dayglow colors. All right, another big influence on these guys, where they got a lot of the idea, the letter forms and the symmetry, was the Viennese secession. And the symmetry, the curve and linear forms, the flat areas of color, we can see reflected in a lot of his poster work. Okay. Readability is always going to be an issue in these posters. Here, he's taken the hair, that's not just the colors of the Bob Dylan, but he's actually put the letter forms into it. And he kind of plays around with the idea of figure ground or positive negative. Because on the first, the Otis, whatever that is, he's got the letters in color and the background in black, but then the next one, the Grateful Dead, the letters are black and the background is color. So he flips back and forth between the two of those. And then anything that he was exposed to and he thought was interesting, he went to a show that had Northwestern Indian masked, and so that ended up in one of his posters as well. Okay, so in 1967, he had a falling out with Bill Graham because Bill Graham wasn't paying him enough. And so he quit and Bonnie McLean stepped into the breach. Bonnie McLean was married to Bill Graham. They had met when he worked at the Alice Chalmers dealership and she was the secretary. But she had studied art at Pratt Institute, and so she had a good commercial art sensibility. And so for Christmas that year, he gave her a bunch of art supplies and said, have at it. These are the posters I need to have done. So her work started out a little more medieval, but you can see by the time she gets going, she's borrowing heavily from what Wilson had already done, as well as her knowledge of art. Most of hers have these kind of enigmatic female faces to them, but some of them are real pastiches of a lot of the stuff we've already talked about. So you've got the squares, the op art, you've got medieval motifs, you've got the mandorla shape again, and the Art Nouveau lettering. So she's really using the history of art. Okay, my last guy is Lee Conklin. And Conklin, again, kind of stepped into the breach after Wilson got out of it. And this particular one is for Procol Harum and Santana, and it's for a Halloween show. And so he's using the kind of jack-o'-lantern idea with the orange and the black. But again, he's flipping. So Procol Harum is orange letters, and then Santana is black letters, flipping back and forth. And there, where all my blue arrows are, that's where there's these kind of scary, distorted jack-o'-lantern-y faces. And he likes that idea of building kind of secret things into it, so you have to look at it to really understand what's going on. This poster for bands including the Grateful Dead is, when you first look at it, it's a lion roaring. But as you start to break it down, you can see that the lion's mouth is actually the body of a woman. And she's got like a puffy skirt on, and the teeth become a necklace. Then the eyes are screaming heads going to the side. And then the cheeks with the whiskers are people getting stabbed with whiskers. And then at the very top, above the eyes, there's a little kind of screaming black figure and two white faces on either side of it. Okay, so his kind of typography was different than what Wilson was doing. Wilson was doing that kind of Vienna secessionist rounded curvy forms, and Conklin's were much more pointy, actually much more like the flame poster that Wilson had done earlier. But this one in particular, the longer you look at it, the more you see. Every single time you see the black letters that spell out Fillmore at the top, in between them are nude female figures. Okay, so right in the middle, the one holding the mask is a woman facing backwards, and then there's profile, and then there's frontal. The same with the blue letters. They're all nude females of the blue, the orange letters with the blue background. Then you've got these little blue kind of gremlin-y figures down below and two faces. So he wants you to look at the poster because there's a lot in it. All right, so we're now at the end of 1968, New Year's Eve to 1969, and Conklin is using those same kind of built-in extra forms, kind of turning into a tree at the top. He's got the skull with the flower crown around it that he's taken from the other poster design. And he's got symbols of time, the two little figures down at the bottom that have their hourglasses there. The representation of the year itself becoming kind of a person. In the Renaissance, they're called vanitas paintings, and they're supposed to reveal something about the person and show the passage of time. So of course the skull is a symbol of death, that's the passage of time, the death of the year, and then the baby kind of screaming as he breaks out of the top of it. And then kind of the fullness of the flowers as the new year comes into bloom. And I think that's the last of it.
Well, while Pat is working on getting my slideshow up and going, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jan Loft, and I'll be talking about and covering the music of 1968. I do have to tell you that tonight's presentation is going to be different than what I did last night at the university and what I did last week at Gold College, because some of the technology is not working properly tonight. And you have to have audio if you're going to do the music of 1968. And also the technology doesn't want to bring up my videos, my things from YouTube and some film clubs. And at first I'm kind of distressed. And then I had a little conversation with myself, and I thought, hey, this is 1968. We're all going to go back to 1968 tonight. We didn't have YouTube. We didn't have video clips in 1968, but we listened to our music on the radio. Well, then the audio didn't want to work for a while, so Paula has rigged up some audio for me tonight. So these are our transistor radios, okay? Because we didn't have fine stereophonic music too much. Maybe you had a nice stereo at home, but most of the time we listened to our music on our transistor radios. So, you know, doodle-loot, doodle-loot, doodle-loot. We're all going back to 1968 now, okay? We're gonna make this work. And I too want to thank the SMSU History Club for inviting me to be a part of this, and thank Joan Gittens and Jeff Kolnick and everybody that's put so much work into this 1968 series. So when I found out last spring that I could be a part of this series, I get really excited about this, and I start doing my research, and I kind of realized right away that 68 really was a mess of things just banging into each other and clashing. I mean, we had the Tet Offensive in January of '68, Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and Robert Kennedy and the Democratic Convention. But meanwhile, people were just living their ordinary lives. So '68 was just this swirling mess of things. So I started thinking of things colliding with each other, and that's how I came up with my title. And I do have to say, though, that For What It's Worth is a shameless ripoff of Buffalo Springfield in 1967, when Stephen Stills wrote the song For What It's Worth, made famous by Buffalo Springfield. So also I want to mention that we all remember things differently than maybe they really were. I mean, we're talking 50 years ago. But also how you remember things and how you experience things is where you were at the time. So my perspective is coming from someone who was in high school in Blue Earth, Minnesota at this time. I-90 did not exist. Blue Earth was the big major intersection of 169 and 16, which was a four-way stop. Can you believe that? Two major U.S. highways, four-way stop. We didn't even have a stoplight there. And now Blue Earth has 3 roundabouts, so that's real different. So that's my perspective of, in 1968, being a kid in high school in a really small town in extreme south central Minnesota. So I was doing my research, and I was finding black, white, folkish, psychedelic, bluesy. It was all rock, and in a certain sense, the musical and social ways in which that paradox works itself out in the 60s, not only a story of pop art form, but of the generation that embraced it. For rock was more than just a musical development. It was a way of seeing the world. It was a way of life. Just 2 weeks ago, I'm reading the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. There's an article on Joan Baez. And I read the article and I think, wow, I can put this in my presentation. Because she's saying in this article, I was lucky to have been around. When Bob Dylan was around, she was able to work with his writing, sing his writing. She thought he was the best that they had in 1968. He was one of the best for their arsenal. And then she went on to say, when she's inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2017, she knew some of it was like, what's she doing here? And then she said, on the other hand, it was about time, because she has been told by many rock artists that she was a conduit from the folk scene into rock and roll. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in my presentation. So how did we get to 1968? I've learned from my colleagues that are really historians, Drs. Kolnick and Williford and Gittens, that to understand something, you have to go back in time. Now, what you really need to understand, and those of us that grew up listening to AM radio, we didn't know they were doing it to us at the time, but we know now. AM radio was highly influential on what we listened to. It was AM radio programmers that were deciding what was going to be played on the radio. Specific formats did not emerge until the 1960s, especially here in the Midwest. Earlier in radio, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and even into the 50s, they did block programming. And a sponsor would buy a chunk of time. So you might have listened to the Purina Dog Chow show. Soap operas come from radio. The soap operas were on the radio. Soap companies sponsored those programs because women were home working, and they did the laundry and they bought the soap. So that's the way it was in radio. But starting in the 1950s, radio programmers said, well, let's not be like that anymore. Let's try to have formats that are a little more specific. But in our part of the country, we had MOR. Moms and dads and kids, we all listened to the same radio station. And if you grew up in Minnesota, you listened to our friendly neighbor from the Northwest. I mean, WCCO was everything. And my brother and I, we'd get up, we'd get ready for school in the morning. WCCO was on the kitchen radio. So the kids and the folks, we all listened to the same radio. But starting in the early 1960s, late 50s out on the coasts, because the coasts were always way ahead of us, but finally they started formatting, and there were stations that would play rock and roll. Now, it was very, very difficult to find rock and roll in this part of Minnesota, south central Minnesota. But finally, a station up in Minneapolis, WDGY, yeah, you remember it, that those call letters are still used, but it's a completely different radio station now. They had the greatest little theme, you know, summertime, and the listening is Ouija, because it was called Ouija. And they started playing rock and roll. Well, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, had really whack rules back in those days, and they had said that all AM stations had to reduce their power to 50% at sunset and then could come back at sunrise, and you're remembering it as well. So us kids, finally about 1965, we can listen to rock and roll in Blue Earth, Minnesota during the day, and then right about sunset, you know, it just disappeared because they had cut their power. So what did we do? We would go to the big 50-watt clear channel stations, because where they were doing, all these little daytimers, AM daytimers, had to go off the air. Had to go off the air. The ones that were cutting their powers, half power, they didn't share the same frequencies, but all these other stations went off the air. And then these big 50-watt AMers would go out of their omnidirectional pattern, and they'd go directional, and they could bend and shape their patterns. And they knew there was a whole bunch of kids in Iowa and Minnesota that wanted to hear them. So at night, and I would lay with my transistor radio on my pillow beside my head, and we would listen to KAAY out of Little Rock, Arkansas, or KOMA out of Oklahoma City, or WLS out of Chicago, and we'd listen to John Records Landecker, and Records really is my middle name. You know, so this is what we would do. That's how difficult it was to find our kind of music. And then I'd wake up in the morning and my radio would just be because they had pulled themselves back into their omnidirectional pattern. So we worked really, really hard to get our rock and roll music. And don't forget that AM radio was very commercial. They did not want to upset anybody, because, you know, people got upset, then they didn't advertise. And yeah, we can try it, well, we'll get there, but hopefully we'll get the audio, but not quite yet. So anyway, yeah, FM didn't come until the 1970s. You might have had an FM dial on a fancy radio, you might have had her in your car, but that wonder bar could go up and down and you wouldn't find anything. There wasn't anything on FM. Stations that had a license for both would probably simulcast. They would simultaneously broadcast the same program out to the AM frequency and the FM frequency. It wasn't until the 1970s that the FCC said, you have to start splitting your programming. So in the United States, AM radio's really afraid of music performed and written by black musicians. First of all, rock and roll is scaring most moms and dads anyway, and then to have this music from Negro musicians was pretty disturbing. So I hope that the audio will come up. The visual's pretty funny, but we might have to listen to some commercials too, because Pat Boone doing Little Richard. Now, if you can see the video, it's just pictures of Pat Boone, you know, but what mom and dad wouldn't want their daughter to bring home Pat Boone, right, you know? Okay, thanks, Pat, that's enough of that. I don't have time to play everything in its entirety, but there's also versions of Fats Domino's Ain't That a Shame, done by Pat Boone. You know, so there was a lot of white cover versions out there, but we all know of Sam Phillips' Famous quote, if I could find a white man who had the Negro sound in the Negro field, I could make $1 million. And he found the guy, right? See if I can, yeah. You know, it's legend. Elvis walked into Sun Records and there you go. Thanks, Pat. So we'll move on then. So here's other groovy things we need to know. If you've ever wondered why Cleveland, Ohio has the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it's because of Alan Freed. Alan Freed was at a radio station in Cleveland, Ohio. He worked at night, and starting even in the late 50s, but early 60s, he rebelled against that notion that I can't play the original artists and musicians. I'm gonna play the black musicians. I'm gonna play their music. So he broke all kinds of rules. He got caught up in the payola scandal and died very young in 1965, but in retrospect, they realized what he did for rock and roll music. So he was the first non-performing artist to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and that's why Cleveland has the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So as you can see, he really was instrumental in black musicians to be on the radio. Now, stores are getting smart. They figure out, hey, we got these teenagers out there, we got these people, they want to buy these records. So we need to have the records in our stores because they knew there was too much money to be made. And as everybody knows, that Brian Epstein was heir to a big department store in England, and these teenagers were coming in and asking for these records, and he goes to his dad and said, hey, can I have a little corner of the store, and I want to get records and sell records because the teenagers want the records. He eventually met the Beatles and becomes their manager, and Brian Epstein very instrumental in the Beatles becoming who they are. Meanwhile, over in England, Liverpool, places that had big docking areas, American sailors were coming into England, bringing American R&B, jazz, ragtime, folk, country, and they created skiffle music. So British teens were actually a little bit ahead of American teens when it comes to American music. And there was a young guy over in England, he had a skiffle group called Johnny and the Moondogs, and Johnny happened to be a kid named John Lennon. So John Lennon started out with skiffle music. Okay, we have a trivia portion for this evening. Jackie Branston, I just threw this in here because I thought that was kind of fun. Jackie Branston and the Delta Cats recorded Rocket 88 in 1951. A lot of people will consider it the first song that was kind of a rock and roll song. So here's my trivia question. What was the first rock and roll song about? A car. Who said that? Okay, Al. Yeah, actually, Oldsmobile made the Rocket 88. So the first kind of rock and roll song was about a car, and that was a theme. So Al, later, you can come up, and you can either have a really groovy tie-dye headband, or you can take one of these and you could paint it psychedelic and turn it into a sun catcher, or put a hook on it, and then you have a really groovy peace symbol that says peace on it. So those are our prize options tonight. Okay, so now it's the 1960s, and Dr. Zarzana here is going to get a big kick out of this because he grew up in California. So here comes the Beach Boys. They hit the scene, their songs, Cars, Being True to Your School, Girls, California Surfing. Surfing in the beach is considered one of the first subcultures in America as far as teenagers. And Jan and Dean and others soon followed, very, very white, very bouncy. Here is where the musical gap between parents and teenagers really started. And it was a couple weeks ago you were here, Jim, and you even said our generation stopped listening to the same music as our parents in the same radio station. And this is what was happening. I can so much remember getting in the car with my mom, and we'd have a discussion on which station we'd listen to. And if I'd win, she'd say, well, okay, but keep it low. Don't have it turned up too loud, you know. So anyway, you know, we finally had music that our parents really didn't want to relate to, but we did. Now, meanwhile, especially on the East Coast and in New York City, folk music starts to come on. And they were very serious. Folk musicians, they had a message, you know, the Pete Seegers, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, there was a whole lot more. But they recorded music meant to provoke thought. And they wanted a message, and they wanted people to think about what was going on. It was not rock and roll. I found this one quote. It said, there was a coffee house could be found in most college towns, even if it was in the basement of the First Methodist Church. And I looked back on that. That's true. Every college town had a coffee house. Folk music was considered by some to be more intellectual, more sophisticated, rather superior. And real folkies would look down their nose like at the Kingston Trio. Kingston Trio really wasn't a folk group. They were collegiate, they were amusing, and the closest thing they ever got to a protest song was Where Have All the Flowers Gone in 1962. So now we've got the music, it's starting to bang into each other. We've got the folk music, we've got surf music, and meanwhile, over in England, the BBC is filtering out this kind of music. They didn't want this rude, barbaric stuff. And at first, they thought in America that only middle and low class whites and blacks would like rock and roll. But they were wrong. I mean, that was a misconception. Young people were really looking to rock and roll as, you know, something uniquely their own. The Beatles opened up a gate. Bob Dylan even said they were doing things that nobody else was doing. And a kid by the name of Roger McGuinn goes to see the Beatles A Hard Day's Night, and he comes out and he goes, I want to be in a band. I want to be in a rock band. I want to be in a rock band. And he got together with a guy named David Crosby and a guy by the name of Chris Hillman and one other guy, and they became the Byrds. And Roger McGuinn really was a successful musician, and you know, he's still very, very talented today. The Byrds, very recognizable because, you can help me out, is that a Rickenbach, that jangly? The Byrds always had that, well, the Byrds always had that jangly guitar sound though, and I think it's a Rickenbach guitar, that very distinct sound. Meanwhile, in Detroit, here comes Motown. And a very, very distinct sound. Motown shows up on the AM radio charts. It's a very tight-knit corporation, and I did a lot of research on that, and Berry Gordy Jr. was very strict. You know, a lot of his early singers and artists like Diana Ross and the Supremes, they were still in high school. And he insisted they graduated from high school. He expected decorum, manners, and courtesy. That's why if you, to this day, I think some of the classiest videos and moves are like the Four Tops and the Temptations. Those guys were smooth, they were suave. They always had on a tuxedo or suits, and they had that choreography that was just smooth. And the young women were sent to like a finishing school, and they were taught how to gracefully get in and out of a car and have manners. And that's why you always saw those early girl groups like the Supremes in very elegant sequin gowns. He wanted his artists to be, you know, very elegant and to follow choreography. Detroit emerges. Down south, you got Memphis. Muscle Shoals had a completely different sounds, like Sam and Dave, and recording artists like that came out of Muscle Shoals. Nashville. So we got all these things going on, and I read where it was red clay versus sequins, because of course red clay, Muscle Shoals, and recording studios out of the South. One category of music, though, that I just couldn't ignore You might remember this. Do you remember the teen tragedy songs? I mean, it was horrible. We had Last Kiss, out on a date in Daddy's car. We hadn't driven very far. There in the road, straight ahead. The engine was stalled, and they run into it, and and he gives her her last kiss, and now he knows he's got to be good so that when he dies, he can go to heaven to see his baby. Tell Laura I love her. He wants to buy her a ring, so he takes his car down to the racetrack, and he dies, crashes and dies. But before he dies, he says, tell Laura I love her. Teen Angel, the cars on the railroad tracks, they're out of the car. They're saved. And then she remembers his class ring is in the car. So she runs back, gets in the car, train hits her, and she's dead. And then there was Lori, very touching song. This guy goes to a high school dance. He meets Lori. He walks her home. She's a little chilly. And all guys wore leather sweaters, in those days. And so he gives her his leather sweater, and she goes in the house. And he's on his way home. Oh, I forgot his leather sweater. Goes back to the house, knocks on the door. Hello, sir. Tonight I met your daughter, Lori, and she, borrowed my sweater. And he's like, young man, you are very cruel. My Lori died 1 year ago tonight. So the kid goes to the graveyard, and what's draped across her grave, of course, is his leather sweater. And then the other one that we all remember very well, very sad, very tragic. Hopefully it'll come up. Remember Patches from Old Shanty Town? And it's the typical rich boy, poor girl story. And his parents won't let them date. Patches has drowned herself. And then by the end of the song, he says, Patches, I'll join you tonight. So now, and I said this last night, I think I was permanently scarred by this stuff. Because years later, when Bobby Goldsboro came out with Honey, I listened to the song once. I knew the story. Okay, he plants the tree, see how big the tree has grown, because Honey's dead, And once you heard the song and you knew the story, that was it. I never wanted to hear it again. And I think it was those songs that did it. Okay, so by the mid-1960s, California cool starts to emerge. Surf music's a little bit left behind. More about the nightlife. It became a little more intellectual. They weren't around at the time, but groups like Eagles and groups like that came out of Southern California, it started them. Folk country rock really was never intentional. The Flying Burrito Brothers and those groups, that was kind of an accident. But music started to have meaning behind a sock hop, puppy love, and teen tragedy. And this is one that still, to me, to this day, is just really kind of gives me the chills. I still really like it. You kind of listen to the lyrics. This would have been pretty racy at the time. To this day, I get the hairs on my arms stand up when I hear that song. I really, that was Janissean, by the way. But at the same time, 2 years earlier, we had Sergeant Barry Sadler and the Ballad of the Green Beret. When Pat and I were doing this research, we found out he did not have a good ending. First of all, he wasn't a very nice man. Sergeant Barry Sadler was not a nice man. He's convicted of murder in California eventually, runs out of the country, and he's somewhere down in Central America, and he gets mixed up. He's murdered. So Sergeant Barry Sadler, he had a big hit with the Battle of the Green Beret. And then there's Country Joe McDonald and the Fish. I don't know if you noticed them on some of Pat's posters. And remember the Fish cheer? And it started with an F, and it was 4-letter word, but it wasn't F-I-S-H, But the Fixin' to Die rag, and it's 1, 2, 3, what do we fight for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. So, so again, we've got all this music. Some of it's got a message, some of it doesn't. Meanwhile, on AM, airplay is essential. They can't sell records if it doesn't make the radio, the top 40. It's still controlling the content and the behavior, and it's still sanitizing. And they really wanted to watch out for those hippies and their drug music, so the FCC is always looking for drug lyrics. And artificial groups start coming at this time. These are groups these weren't even real people. I mean, the Archies, they were cartoon characters. But some of the best musicians in the country were studio musicians. And out in California, the very famous The Wrecking Crew, Glenn Campbell came out of The Wrecking Crew, Leon Russell was a member of The Wrecking Crew, and there was one woman who broke into the big studio musician life. Her name was Carol Kay, and she was the only woman that made it in that business, and she was a bass player. And one day, this guy named Sonny Bono was in the recording studio, and he goes, I got this song, it kind of goes like this. And she said, it's blah, it needs a good beginning. She picks up a bass guitar and goes, bum, 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 bum. And it's the opening of The Beat Goes On. That's her, and she just picked up her guitar and said, hey, well, how does this sound? And then they said, yeah, that sounds good. So the next time you hear The Beat Goes On by Sonny and Cher, think of Carol Kay picking up her bass guitar. So she was a member of the Wrecking Crew, and those artificial groups, those were studio musicians recording those songs, and then they'd hire guys to go out and pretend to be those groups, but they weren't real. The Monkees, Mickey Dolenz, and Davy Jones were actors, and Michael Nesmith and Peter Tork kind of thought of themselves as musicians, but like Mickey Dolenz said once, we were acting like musicians. We were actors. We weren't musicians any more than Lorne Greene was Ben Cartwright owning the Bonanza. So it was this artificial music, and more comes up later. Meanwhile, now we're out in San Francisco, leads the way FM radio. They developed a format called AOR, Album-Oriented Rock. And AM used to have this rule that a song had to be under 3 minutes. So think about it now. If you listen to an oldies station, listen to how short those songs are. And everything was vinyl in those days, so everything was records at a radio station. So those radio announcers must have had to run really fast if they had to go to the bathroom, get back in time before that 2.5-minute song was over. But there were album versions. So you listen to The Doors' Light My Fire, and we listened to 2 minutes and 52 seconds on AM radio, but if you had the album, you were listening to the 7-minute, 6-second version of the song. Now, here's another trivia question for you. There was a group that said, yeah, well, we don't care about your silly rules. We have this song, and if you don't play it on your radio stations, you're really stupid, because this is a huge song, and we're a huge group, and AM radio did give in. They didn't on anybody else, but they did on this one. So what song in 1968 broke that mold and went beyond 3 minutes?
White Rabbit.
No.
Okay. Oh, Gata Vida.
No, it's not In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. That came later, but it's a good guess. Yes? Hey Jude? Absolutely. It was the Beatles and Hey Jude, and I got that written down too. That's 7 minutes and 11 seconds. Again, I got to tell you about my mother. That would come on the radio, and she'd say, it's such a pretty song. I just don't know why they have to do all that screaming at the end of it. She'd always say that. So it was Hey Jude. But most of the time, still on AM radio, they kept it into this, short thing. But why San Francisco? blame it on Berkeley. Let's blame it on Berkeley. You know, they had be-ins, free speech movements, and as Pat showed you with those posters, up in San Francisco at the Fillmore West and places like that, the music was very free-forming. I mean, the Grateful Dead, Quicksilver Messenger Service, groups like that, they get up on stage, a song might last 45 minutes. Meanwhile, down in Southern California, they were much more studio-oriented. They were much, much more structured. And the studio perfection. You can see there Spiro Agnew. He's pretty worried. He doesn't want I Get By with a Little Help from My Friends played on the radio because he's pretty darn sure those friends are actually drugs. I will tell you how strict radio was. We couldn't play Van Morrison's Brown Eyed Girl because they were making love in the green grass behind the stadium. Maybe didn't want that on the radio. And couldn't say the word liquor unless it was part of the store's name. So Lower North Mankato on Belgrade Avenue, there was A1 Liquor. Do you know what you bought at A1 Liquor? Your favorite beverage. That's what you bought there, you know. Stock up for the big Labor Day weekend at A1 Liquor. Stock up on your favorite beverage. You couldn't do prices, you couldn't talk about whiskey or beer or any of that. So it was pretty strict back in those days when you stopped to think about it. By the Summer of Love in '67, as you can see there, rock has become the common language, you know, the lingua franca of the counterculture. Because a common language is when a whole bunch of people come together and they all speak a different language, but yet they'll come up with a common language. And so if the music was to be the medium, then the companies wanted the money. So they're still very aware of that. Oh, yeah. Who said Hey Jude? Yes, you later will have your choice of either a bandana or, you know, the little thing. So now it's 1968, boom. The New York Review of Books, they're studying Sgt. Pepper, high school teachers talking about Dylan, Peter Mack's psychedelic art. Somebody asked last night, now how come Jan mentions Peter Mack and Pat didn't? First of all, she can't possibly cover all the art of 1968 any more than I can cover all the music. And Peter Max did not do poster art, which she was talking about, and he didn't do San Francisco art. But Peter Max, you can remember Yellow Submarine graphics? His looked a lot like that. And he hints that he did the graphics for Yellow Submarine, but other people will say, no, he didn't. But Peter Max did a lot that looked like that. And he really did a lot of faces, heads of the Statue of Liberty in a real psychedelic way. So, you know, he had a very distinct style. The counterculture was the culture. Supergroups come out starting in '68. You had Cream, Blind Faith, Traffic. They were all rather short-lived because those guys would get together, create the music they wanted to create, and then they'd move on and do other things. The Rascals, though, here they come. They had a song with a message. We first started, you know, hearing in the lyrics. So, in the sake of time, can't listen to the whole thing. So, now we hear heavy metal. That's a term introduced for the first time in 1968. So, for a prize, what song included heavy metal in the lyrics? Huh? No.
Something about a liquor store?
Your favorite beverage. I haven't had any audience yet get this one, so don't feel too bad. Steppenwolf's Born to be Wild. I Like Smokin' Lightnin', Heavy Metal Thunder, Racing with the Wind and the Feeling That I'm Under. Again, I have to tell a mom story. So I ride a motorcycle. My brother, who's 4 years older than I am, he rides a motorcycle. I'm probably in my late 40s, Denny early 50s. He lives the other side of Rochester. When Mom was alive, she was in Blue Earth. And so he calls me up and he says, hey, let's ride our motorcycles to Blue Earth, stay overnight, and then let's ride together down around Blue Earth. So that's what we did. We go down there, and Mom's kitchen door went straight out into the garage, and my brother and I were out in the garage, and we're getting our bikes ready to go for our ride. And my mom comes to the door and she goes, where are you kids gonna go? And my brother says, I don't know, we're just gonna get our motor started and head out on the highway. And I said, looking for adventure and whatever comes our way. And our mother doesn't realize those are the lyrics to Born to Be Wild. She thinks we talk like that, you know? And, you know, she was just, it was so sweet. She had no clue, and she was like, okay, well, you have fun and be safe. And she closes the door and, you know, goes on back in the house. But anyway, and by the way, they took that term from William Burroughs' The Naked Lunch. So that's when heavy metal first gets into our vernacular. Rock as art versus just rock. But move over flower power. Now some folks are getting angry. And by the way, I had to throw this in for all of us Minnesotans. A scholarly, poetry-loving senator from Minnesota picked up on that, and he built it into his campaign.
Eugene McCarthy.
Yep, there you go, Eugene McCarthy. Yep. So, regardless of all this, recording companies still calling the shots. Singles are still very important, even though albums are becoming very important. If you remember certain songs from albums, it's because you were listening to an album, not so much the 45 that was being played on AM radio. Okay, bubblegum emerges in 1968. Again, phony groups, they did not exist. You had the 1910 Fruit Gum Company. Those were studio musicians. Those were not a group. They were not a real group. And Ohio Express, Yummy, Yummy, Yummy. That was the Ohio Express. They would record this song, and then they'd get some guys to go out, you know, be on a stage. I'm going to show, oh, I can't show you that later. I don't have the video. The video is 1910 Fruit Gum Company singing 1, 2, 3 Red Light. They don't even have microphones in front of me. You know, they're just kind of standing there. And they were probably embarrassed to death, but, you know, they were out doing it. So now you've got bubblegum music, you know, Yummy, 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 and Simon Says, and 1, 2, 3 Red Light. All this music is swirling around in the same year. They're still manipulating us. And there goes your Hey Jude, forces old AM radio rule. Black musicians and recording companies still promote the singles more than the albums. That's why they're really on the charts in 1968. Otis Redding has his first and only top 10 record, of course, posthumously, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, came out after he and his band were killed in that plane crash. And the Supremes give up sequins for sweatshirts with Love Child. And that was pretty radical in 1968 to have a song about an illegitimate child. And I'm really sorry that I can't show you that video, because she has on a sweatshirt. And then she's got the cheesiest cutoff. They're supposed to be frayed cutoffs. Well, remember, we'd cut ours off, and then through washing, we actually had real fringe, frayed. But hers is kind of cut, meant to look jaggedy. You know, they're bad. I wish I could show them to you, but Black Power advocates, they're not kidding around. We're hearing H. Rap Brown, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael. SNCC is around at that time. Hendrix actually gets flack from black people, because he's not being black. He was psychedelic, and he was told, you need to be more black. But James Brown comes along, and he says, get your bad self. And, you know, this was, you know, I'm black and I'm proud. And he goes on to say about, you know, we deserve things. We should get what we deserve. Thank you, Pat. And, you know, when you open up the Marshall Independent, it runs down the left side, page 2, on this date in history. And it was just 2 weeks ago, on that date in 1968, the U.S. Olympic Committee suspended Tommy Smith and John Carlos for that, Black Power salute from the Olympic medal stand, and they were stripped of their medals. But soul music is very popular. Sly and the Family Stone, if I'd known I was only going to have audio, I didn't like the video, but remember this? Sometimes I'm right, and I can be wrong. My own beliefs are in my song. The butcher, the thinker, the drummer, and then makes no difference what group I'm in. I'm everyday people, yeah. There is a blue one who can't accept the green one for living with a fat one, trying to be a skinny one. Different strokes for different folks. And it was all about, we're all everyday people. We're all very, very different. There is a long hair who doesn't like the short hair for being such a rich one that will not help the poor one. And there is a yellow one that won't accept the black one, that won't accept the red one, that won't accept the white one. But part of the lyrics too is Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Remember that in that song? So the next time you hear everyday people, think about those lyrics. Okay, so I thought let's just take a look at what was really popular the latter part of 1968. So I started in August. And so we've got the Rascals, okay, Jumpin' Jack Flash, Rolling Stones real big, The Doors, Hello, I Love You. Classical Gas. Hear this guitar, this musical. He was on the Smothers Brothers, Mason Williams, and it was a huge song, instrumental. And to this day, I'll turn the radio up when that one comes on. I still really, really like it. Stone Soul Picnic, Fifth Dimension, I Can't Stop Dancing, Archie Bell and the Drells, and I always say, remember when Archie Bell and the Drells first came out? Hey, we're Archie Bell and the Drells. We're from Houston, Texas, and we can dance just as good as you want. I listened to the radio a lot in those days, so. Okay, so let's listen to a little bit of Steppenwolf. And this made the soundtrack of Easy Rider in 1969. The Lorenzen kids did not write those lyrics. Yeah, so let's wait for the heavy metal part. Here it comes. That's where it is. Okay, so you got all this going on. Now you're listening to your AM radio, right? You got your AM radio on. And the next song that came on could have been... No?
Yeah, it's got the commercial.
Oh, this is the commercial, okay. Oh, the Vogues. If you listen to these lyrics now, they're creepy. A guy would get arrested doing this today, I'm in the shadows, I'm following you, kind of creepy. Walking behind you. Okay, enough of that. We were joking. You know why songs like that were still really popular? Because at high school dances, guys would never dance except the slow songs. The girls would be out dancing together, but the guys would come right there. Okay, next song could have been this one. This is a pretty good video of Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, and then Eric Clapton, who was in Cream. Okay, so you're listening to your AM radio, you got Cream. The next song could have been...
Yeah, got the milk.
Now remember, these are just studio musicians. This is a fake group. It was a very popular song. But look what was #1, September 21st of 1968.
I love this song.
Yeah.
That
She
part is the
And she calls out all the hypocrites of Harper Valley. Guess she told them, didn't she? Okay, and she's there until here comes Hey Jude by the Beatles, and they're number one going into, well into November. They're displaced by the Supremes, and here's where, if you could see her cutoffs. It did. Pretty radical for 1968. Thanks, Pat. You always see Aretha Franklin, she's in there. Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell, You're All I Need to Get By. The Vogues are back. Scoring again, a big hit song with My Special Angel. Bee Gees, I Gotta Get a Message to You. And this next song, I'm pretty sure was the Grammy of 1968 for Song of the Year. O.C. Smith and Little Green Apples.
I think Glenn Campbell did a remake of it, that's what.
Oh, I wake up in the morning with my head down and my
It was a big song.
I stumble to the breakfast table while the kids are going off to school.
Can you zoom in a little bit to where it's kind of the
She reaches out,
the
and if that's not
here's the part that brings up the Little Green Apple.
But parents
and all that.
Oh yeah. You didn't care if your folks heard these lyrics, you know.
God didn't make this green
It was a big hit song. Now, this next one, I really do wish I had the video. You can't believe it. So after O.C. Smith, you know, yeah, your mom and dad are real happy, and you still got the audio up, and this is the next song.
Here, you can see it a little on.
Yeah. Look at that. Somebody said last night, hey, I think I know what my Halloween costume's gonna be this year. That was a big hit song. So now your folks are upset, Mark, because you're like, turn that down, that's awful. So the next song that came on the radio might have been this one. We have to give special credit to our DJ tonight, Dr. Pat Brace. This is a real cheesy video. Those guys are like this.
With their trumpet and their saxophone.
This is their choreography. But, you know, yeah.
I'm a girl watching girls go by.
All righty. And Mary Hopkins, you'll remember, those were the days, the Grassroots. By the way, I don't think they will ever make the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They had a tremendous number of hit songs. But those were guys, they were the Grassroots, and they could play their instruments. They toured, but every one of their hit songs was recorded in Los Angeles by all the instrumentals were played by the Wrecking Crew. It wasn't the guys that were the Grassroots that were playing those instruments. So, Gary Puckett and the Union Gap. Here's James Brown. Just for 1 week, he made it to number 10, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. The Turtles, Eleanor, funny thing about that, the two guys that were the Turtles just hated that Happy Together was their big hit song. They hated that song. So they do this one as kind of a sneer. You know, think of the lyrics, you know, Eleanor, gee, I think you're swell, you know, and they think it's a poke in the eye to Happy Together, and it becomes a big hit song. So I guess that's what people wanted the Turtles to be. Cream is back with White Room, Johnny Nash, Hold Me Tight, Stevie Wonder, For Once in My Life. Glenn Campbell is no longer in the Wrecking Crew. He's out on his own now. doing his own music. Steppenwolf's back with Magic Carpet Ride. Marvin Gaye, great song, heard it through the grapevine. Johnny Taylor is asking, meanwhile, who's making love to your old lady while you're out making love? Pretty racy. The Classics 4, Stormy. Bobby Vinton, I Love How You Love Me. Both Sides Now, Judy Collins. I'm Gonna Make You Love Is Supremes, Temptations and the Temptations. And before we start this next one, the next one is the video that I regret that I can't show you because it's very poignant. It's very, very touching. But so 1968, as you can tell, was just this collision of everything. But finally, in December of 1968, we got a song that kind of pulled a bunch of things together, especially the fourth stanza. So we'll listen to this one in its entirety. But the video is very, very poignant. I wish I could show it to you. Oh yeah, some of you can see it a little bit there on the screen a little bit.
Anybody here seen my old friend Abraham? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but it seems good they die young. You know, I just looked around and he's anybody here seen my old friend John? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but it seems the good they die young. I just looked around and he's can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but it seems good they die young. I just look around and he's gone. Didn't you love the things that they stood for? Didn't they try?
Somebody in the audience last night shared that to this day, that song makes them tear up, makes them cry, especially the part with, has anybody here seen my old friend Bobby? And I thought I saw him walking up over the hill with Abraham and Martin and John. So I want to go, the last screen takes us back to, oh, by the way, you can see Dion hadn't had a hit since '63 with Donna the Prima Donna. Okay, so I want to go back to the beginning when I shared with you the music world sees battles between tradition, insurgency. Rock has always been a collision and a marriage of minority culture and majority tastes. It brings out, it highlights the tensions between convention, rebellion, the familiar, freedom from the familiar, a tug of war. Rock is a metaphor for American culture, a vital, unpredictable mess of individualism and assimilation. So, thank you for bearing with me without our videos, but we all went back to 1968, and hope you enjoyed that journey. One thing I wanted to share, because Jim's in the audience tonight, I shared last night. When you were a kid, a teenager, in the upper Midwest in the mid-60s with the surf music, we all so wanted to be California. We wanted to dress California. Slow dancing, we called it California dancing. I mean, everything was California. Everything was California. And when I was 15, my aunt and uncle took me to California. And the number one thing I had to do is I had to go to Malibu. I wanted to see Malibu Beach, and I wanted to see surfers and that whole world. So, you know, you grew up in California, you probably, not that big a deal. But to us, California was just so important. So, okay, how about some questions you might have for Pat or me?
Well,
Yeah.
I wanted to comment on the Beach Boys. You know, their first album, they're lined up and they're carrying that surfboard, and they have a Pendleton shirt on.
Yeah.
And of course, we all went out and bought Pendleton shirts. But they were on the beach at night where it cools off, and we lived in Sacramento where it could be 105. And it's pretty stupid to wear a Pendleton shirt in August, let me tell you.
Yeah, but you look good. You look good, yeah.
And then, when you talk about records and the explosion of buying records, I lived down the street from what they could call, it's kind of like liquor. They would call it at that time Tower Drugs. Now, it'd be a pharmacy, but the Tower Drugs. And the pharmacist was always after
now it wants
his
to play.
son
Oh, that's okay.
to do something worthwhile to the son. Well, I want to sell records. So we started selling records in the corner of Tower Drugs, and that blew up and grew into
Tower Records is
and then,
iconic.
The digital and download killed him off. I think he just died, the fellow that started that. They went bankrupt. I know people that worked for him that got stiffed because they went bankrupt.
Al, did you have your hand?
The Beach Boys have a Minnesota connection.
Yep.
They were being interviewed one time, or I think it was David. But anyway, they were being interviewed about when did you know that you'd made it? And he says, well, our dad drove us to this small club in Minnesota, and we were all set up, and we looked out the back door, and all we could see was headlights coming down the road for miles. You know where that was? Hatfield.
Oh,
Hollyhock Ballroom in Hatfield.
the Hollyhock Ballroom in Hatfield?
Minnesota.
Oh. My brother, I was telling him about this, and he said if you had more time, it's too bad I couldn't emphasize what a powerhouse Minnesota was in the 60s. We had regional hits, but there was a couple that, oh, everybody's heard about the bird. Oh, well, the bird. The bird is, we're out of Minneapolis, the Trashmen, So we had some pretty big hits that came out of here. They tended to be regional, but Minnesota had a very thriving. Now, somebody told me the other day, I do not know if this is true, so, those of you watching this on television, pay no mind, they claim that Kevin Love, who played basketball for the Timberwolves, is related to Mike Love of the Beach Boys. Maybe, I don't know. Didn't research that. I don't know the veracity of that. So, any other questions? Well, I want to thank Paula profusely for rigging up our transistor radio stations here, our transistor stations. Remember transistor radios? They really were pocket transistors, weren't they? We took them everywhere with us. Oh, yeah.
They didn't call it an earbud, the little one thing.
Because I told the students last night, we did not have satellite radio. We did not have any social media. We didn't have iPods. We learned the music because we were listening to the radio station. And we were being manipulated at the time. We didn't know it. We do now, though, and that's, you had to listen to the radio to find out what the new songs were going to be. Yeah. So it was a great trip back to 1968. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks to Paula, the library. Thanks to Pat for being my audio technician.